What is the most satisfying way you've ever caught a cheater? My husband Mark thinks he is the smartest person in any room. We have been married for 5 years, and he has spent 4 of them building a tech startup that supposedly takes up 18 hours of his day. I am a surgical nurse. I work 12-hour shifts and come home to an empty house. I believed in him. I paid the mortgage and the car notes while he chased his dream. He told me he was doing it for us. He said once the company sold, we would move to the coast and start a family. 3 weeks ago, my sister Sarah called me. She sounded like she had been crying. She told me she saw Mark at a high-end jewelry store in the city. He wasn't alone. He was with a woman who looked about 10 years younger than me. They were holding hands. Sarah followed them to a bistro and watched them feed each other appetizers. I wanted to scream, but I just felt cold. I checked our shared bank accounts. Nothing was missing. Mark is careful. He has a separate business account I never touch. I didn't confront him. I waited until he went to the gym, and I took his old laptop from the closet. He forgot he ever synced his messages to it. I found 4 years of a life I didn't recognize. He wasn't at the office until midnight. He was at an apartment downtown that he rented in his brother's name. The woman is named Elena. She thinks he is a single entrepreneur. He told her his parents were dead, so she wouldn't wonder why she never met them. He told her I was his landlord. The worst part wasn't the cheating. It was the plan. Mark was closing a deal to sell his software for $7 million. He had been talking to a lawyer about how to hide the assets before filing for divorce. He wanted to wait until the papers were signed and the money was in an offshore account before he left me. He was going to leave me with a mortgage I couldn't afford on a nurse's salary while he moved to Europe with Elena. I found out the sale was finalizing on a Friday. Mark told me he was having a small launch party at a local gallery to celebrate the hard work. He asked me to come late because he wanted to introduce me as his secret weapon. I realized then that he wanted me there for the photos. He wanted proof of a happy marriage right up until the end so he could claim the breakup was sudden and mutual. I invited my parents and his parents. I also invited Elena. I found her on Instagram and sent her an anonymous invite to the gallery, saying it was a networking event for Mark's company. I told her there would be a special announcement. When I walked into the gallery, Mark was wearing a tailored suit I had never seen. He looked like a success. He grabbed my hand and led me to the front of the room. He started a speech about how he couldn't have done it without the support of the people in this room. He looked at me with so much fake love it made my skin crawl. I waited until he mentioned the future. He said he was looking forward to the next chapter. That was my cue. I pulled my phone out and connected it to the projector he used for his company logo. I didn't show a slideshow. I showed the lease for the hidden apartment. I showed the text messages where he called me a dead weight he was planning to drop once the wire transfer cleared. I showed the photos of him and Elena at the jewelry store. The room went dead silent. Mark turned around and his face went the color of ash. Elena was standing near the bar. She dropped her glass. She looked at me, and then at him, and then she ran out. My father-in-law stood up and called Mark a disgrace. My own mother just hugged me and whispered that we were leaving. Mark tried to grab my arm and tell me I didn't understand the context. I looked him in the eye and told him I understood perfectly. I told him the moving truck was already at our house and his things were currently being dropped off at his brother's apartment. I also told him I had already contacted a forensic accountant and the divorce attorney he had been emailing. I walked out of the gallery while he was still sputtering, trying to find words that didn't exist. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't feel like I was suffocating. I got into my car and sat there for a second, just listening to the quiet. My phone was vibrating and my purse calls from his mother, texts from Sarah, probably a dozen alerts from the security system at our house. I didn't answer any of them. I drove straight to the house. I had scheduled the movers for 6 p.m., exactly 30 minutes after the party started. When I pulled into the driveway, the big white truck was idling, and 3 guys were already carrying the last of his office furniture out. They were efficient. They didn't ask questions. To them, it was just another job. To me, it was a surgical extraction. I had spent the last week tagging everything that was his with small red stickers. I was generous. I gave him the couch we bought together because I didn't want to sit on something his ghost lived in. I gave him the 6.5-inch TV. I gave him every single dish that wasn't part of my grandmother's set. I wanted the house empty of him. I wanted it to echo. The lead mover, a guy named Mike with calloused hands and a faded baseball cap, walked over to me. "That's the last of the red sticker stuff, ma'am. We're heading to the downtown address now." "Thank you," I said, handing him a $300 tip. "If a man shows up there screaming, just tell him the keys are under the mat and keep moving. He's not your problem." Mike gave me a look that said he'd seen this movie before. "Got it. Good luck, lady." I watched the truck pull away. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of suburban silence that usually felt peaceful but now felt like a vacuum. I went inside and locked the door. The living room was a graveyard of dust bunnies where the furniture used to be. It looked bigger. It looked like a place where I could actually breathe. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were shaking finally. The adrenaline was wearing off and the reality was sinking in. $7 million. That was the number in the emails. He was going to take $7 million, most of which was built on the back of my double shifts and my weary bones, and he was going to disappear. I opened my laptop, my own, not his old one, and logged into the hidden folder where I'd saved everything I found. I had been working with a lawyer, Marcus, who specialized in high-asset divorces. I'd met him in a coffee shop 3 towns over, so nobody would recognize me. "The timing is everything," Marcus had told me. "If he signs that sale agreement before you file, and he moves that money, we're chasing ghosts in the Cayman Islands. You need to hit him while the ink is wet but before the wire clears." I looked at the clock. It was 8:45 p.m. The special announcement at the gallery had been the final nail. By now, the investors who were at that party, men who valued family stability and character as much as they valued code, would be calling their own lawyers. Mark didn't just lose his wife tonight. He lost his reputation. In that world, reputation is the only currency that doesn't fluctuate. My phone rang. It was Mark. I let it go to voicemail. 10 seconds later, he called again. Then again. On the 4th try, I picked up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. "What the hell did you do?" His voice was a jagged mess. He wasn't the confident CEO anymore. He sounded like a cornered animal. "Elena is gone. She's blocking my number. My dad told me never to call his house again. Are you happy? You ruined everything over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding, Mark?" I leaned against the kitchen counter, looking at the spot where his favorite espresso machine used to sit. "The lease in your brother's name? The text where you called me a financial anchor? The 3 carat carat diamond ring you bought her with our joint credit line? Which part is the misunderstanding? I was going to tell you, he stammered. The money. It was for us, eventually. I just needed to secure it first. You don't understand the tech world. It's cutthroat. I had to protect the assets. You were protecting yourself from me, I said, my voice eerily calm. And you failed. By the way, I didn't just call the movers. I called your lead investor, Mr. Henderson. I sent him the same files I showed the gallery. I imagine the morality clause in your contract is looking pretty significant right about now. The silence on the other end was heavy. I could almost hear his brain scrambling, trying to find a loophole, a lie, a way out. But there was no exit. You're a bitch, he whispered. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. I'm a surgical nurse, Mark. I know exactly how to cut out the rot without killing the patient. Don't come to the house. The locks were changed an hour ago. Your clothes are at the apartment with Elena's ghost. Goodbye. I hung up and blocked him. The next few days were a blur of legal filings and phone calls. Marcus was a shark. He filed for an emergency injunction to freeze Mark's accounts. Because we lived in a community property state, and because I could prove he used marital funds to maintain his secret life and his secret apartment, the separate business account wasn't so separate anymore. Mark's startup sale hit a massive snag. The investors didn't pull out, the tech was too good for that, but they forced him out. They used the scandal to trigger a buyout at a fraction of his original stake. He was still going to be wealthy, but he wasn't going to be a multimillionaire, and half of whatever he got was mine. I went back to work on Monday. Being in the OR was the only place I felt normal. In surgery, everything is logical. There is a problem, you fix it, you sew it up, you monitor the vitals, you move on. My coworkers knew something was up, but I didn't give them the details. I just told them Mark and I were separating. It wasn't until I was in the scrub room with my friend Janine that I let a bit of it out. He tried to hide 7 million, I said, washing my hands up to the elbows. Janine stopped scrubbing. 7? As in million? Yeah. He thought I was too tired from my shifts to notice he was a snake. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to take my half, I said. And then I'm going to buy that house on the coast he kept talking about, the one with the wraparound porch. I'm going to live there alone, and I'm never going to pay for someone else's dream again. A month later, I was sitting in Marcus's office for the final mediation. Mark looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit looked like it was wearing him, and the arrogance had been replaced by a simmering, impotent rage. He wouldn't look me in the eye. His lawyer, a slick guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, pushed a stack of papers across the table. My client is prepared to offer a lump sum settlement, the lawyer said, in exchange for a full non-disclosure agreement regarding the details of the, gallery incident. I looked at Marcus. He nodded. I looked at the number on the paper. It was more than I would have made in 20 years of nursing. It was enough to buy the house, retire early, and never think about a mortgage again. No, I said. The room went still. Mark looked up at me for the first time. What do you mean no? That's more than half. You greedy? I don't want the NDA, I said, cutting him off. I don't care about the extra money. I want the right to tell my story. I want everyone in this city to know exactly who you are. Every time someone Googles your name for a new venture, I want them to find the gallery incident. I want the truth to be the shadow you can't outrun. You'll lose $2 million just to spite me? Mark hissed. It's not spite, Mark. It's a public service announcement, I replied. And I'm not losing it. I'm spending it. It's the best money I'll ever spend. We went to court. It was grueling. And it was public. The local business blogs picked it up. Tech founders fall from grace. The $7 million divorce. I had to sit there and listen to his lawyer try to paint me as a disgruntled, neglectful wife who drove him into the arms of another woman. I didn't flinch. I had the receipts. I had the timestamps. I had the lease. In the end, the judge didn't care about his excuses. The settlement was fair, the house was mine, and the NDA was non-existent. The day the divorce was finalized, I drove out to the coast. I found a small cottage, not a mansion, just a place with big windows and the smell of salt in the air. I sat on the porch with a glass of wine and watched the sun go down. My phone chimed. It was a message from an unknown number. I lost the company. I lost everything. I hope you're happy. I didn't even have to guess who it was. I didn't reply. I just deleted the message and blocked the number. I looked out at the ocean, at the vast, cold, honest water. I wasn't happy. Not yet. Happiness is a long-term project. But for the first time in years, I was settled. I was clean. The surgery was over, the rot was gone, and the patient me was going to make a full recovery. I took a sip of my wine and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd enjoyed the taste of anything. I'd been living on caffeine and adrenaline for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small velvet box. It was the 3-carat ring Mark had bought for Elena. The court had awarded it to me as part of the wasteful dissipation of marital assets. It was a beautiful stone, cold and brilliant. It represented 4 years of lies and a future that was never meant for me. I walked down to the edge of the water, where the waves were crashing against the gray rocks. I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel like a character in a movie. I just felt finished. I pulled the ring out of the box and looked at it one last time. It was worth $40,000, a lot of shifts, a lot of late nights. I didn't throw it into the ocean. That's for movies. I put it back in the box and tucked it into my pocket. Tomorrow, I was going to take it to a jeweler, sell it, and donate every single cent to a local shelter for women. I took the ring to a jeweler on 4th Street the next morning. It was a Tuesday. The store smelled like glass cleaner and old carpet. The jeweler was an older man with a loop practically glued to his right eye. He examined the diamond for 3 minutes in complete silence. He didn't care about the story attached to it. He only cared about the clarity, the cut, and the resale value. $32,000, he said, setting it down on a velvet pad. It's a good stone, but the setting is generic. I'll take it, I said. I didn't haggle. I didn't care about the $8,000 difference between what Mark paid and what I was getting. I walked out with a cashier's check, drove straight to the county women's shelter, and handed it to the director. She cried. I didn't. I just asked for a receipt for my taxes and went to my shift at the hospital. For 3 months, my life was exactly what I wanted it to be. Predictable. I worked my 12-hour shifts. I started IVs. I monitored vitals. I held the hands of people waking up from anesthesia. I went back to my cottage on the coast. I painted the living room a pale blue. I bought a coffee maker that only made 1 cup at a time. The silence in my house wasn't a vacuum anymore. It was a shield. Then, on a rainy Thursday in October, security called the nurse's station. We have a visitor for you in the main lobby, the guard said. She says it's personal. I told my charge nurse I was taking a 15-minute break and took the elevator down. I expected to see my sister, or maybe a delivery. It was Elena. She didn't look like the girl from the bistro. The glossy blowout was gone, pulled back into a messy knot. She was wearing a beige trench coat that looked damp, and she was shifting her weight from foot to foot near the sliding glass doors. I stopped 10 feet away from her. I didn't say a word, I just waited. "He ruined my life," she blurted out. Her voice was thin, bordering on hysterical. People in the waiting area looked over. "Mark, he ruined me." "Keep your voice down," I said. "This is a hospital." She took a step closer, her eyes red. "After the gallery. After he lost the company deal. He went crazy. The apartment we had, he stopped paying the rent. We got evicted. But the worst part is the loans." She pulled a crumpled stack of papers from her pocket. "He convinced me to co-sign on bridge loans for his new startup idea. He said his assets were frozen because of his crazy ex-wife. He used my credit, $200,000, and he just disappeared. His phone is disconnected. I'm facing bankruptcy." I looked at her. Really looked at her. She was 24, maybe 25. She had wanted the fairy tale with the wealthy tech founder, and she had ignored all the red flags because the dinners were expensive and the lies were flattering. "Why are you here, Elena?" I asked. My voice was flat. "What do you expect me to do?" "You have the money from the divorce," she pleaded, tears spilling over. "He told me you took millions. You know he conned me. You know what he is. I just need enough to clear the immediate defaults. Please." It was a staggering display of audacity. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my chest. "Let me explain something to you," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "When I was working 14-hour double shifts, changing soiled bedpans and standing on my feet until my joints ached to pay the mortgage, you were drinking champagne with my husband. You didn't ask questions because you didn't want the answers. The money I took from him is mine. I earned every single cent of it." "But he lied to me," she sobbed. "He lied to me for 4 years," I replied. "I hired a forensic accountant and a shark of a lawyer. I fought for myself. I suggest you do the same. Don't ever come to my workplace again." I turned my back on her and walked to the elevator. I didn't look over my shoulder. In the ER, we call it triage. You treat the viable patients. You don't waste resources on dead tissue. Elena was dead tissue. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Narcissists like Mark don't handle total defeat. When they lose control, they don't reflect. They retaliate. 2 weeks later, I was called into the director of nursing's office. When I walked in, an HR representative was sitting in the corner with a manila folder on her lap. My stomach dropped. I had been a nurse for 12 years, and I had never been written up, not even for being late. "Have a seat, Brenda," the director said. She looked deeply uncomfortable. "We received an anonymous complaint this morning via the state medical board portal." "A complaint about what?" I asked. "Diversion of Schedule II narcotics," she said. The words hit the air like lead weights, specifically fentanyl and Dilaudid from the surgical Pyxis. I stopped breathing for a second. In my profession, that accusation is a death sentence. It's not just a firing offense. It's a lose your license, go to prison offense. "That is a lie," I said. My voice didn't shake. "You know me, Brenda. You know my record." "I do," she said, rubbing her forehead. "But protocol is protocol. When a formal complaint is lodged with the state board, we have to suspend you pending an internal audit and a mandatory drug screening. You need to hand over your badge. You'll be on unpaid administrative leave effective immediately." I didn't argue. Arguing makes you look guilty. I stood up, unclipped my ID badge from my scrubs, and placed it on her desk. I went to the lab downstairs, gave blood, urine, and hair samples, and walked out to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I knew exactly who did this. Mark knew that taking my money wasn't enough to break me. He knew my license was my identity. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus. He crossed the line from civil to criminal, I told my lawyer. He filed a false report with the nursing board. I want him crushed. "An anonymous report is hard to trace," Marcus warned. "I don't care what it costs," I said. "Hire the best private investigator you have. Find the digital footprint." I spent the next 10 days sitting in my cottage, staring at the ocean. The hospital audited my Pyxis pulls. Every single milligram of medication I had dispensed over the last 2 years was accounted for. My drug screens came back perfectly clean, but the board investigation was still open, which meant I was still grounded. On day 11, Marcus called me. "We got him," he said. "Mark is arrogant, but he's sloppy." The investigator subpoenaed the IP logs from the state board's portal. The complaint was filed from a public Wi-Fi network at a coffee shop downtown. But the MAC address, the unique hardware identifier of the device used, matches the laptop Mark surrendered during discovery in your divorce. I closed my eyes. A wave of pure, unfiltered vindication washed over me. "What's the next move?" "We don't just sue him," Marcus said. "Filing a false report to a government agency is a misdemeanor. Interfering with a medical license via fraudulent claims is actionable for massive damages. We draft a civil suit for tortious interference, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We attach the digital forensics. But before we file, we send it to him." "No," I said. "I don't want a settlement. I want my life back. If we sue him, it takes years. He drags it out. What do you want to do?" "Draft an affidavit," I said. "A complete confession stating that he fabricated the complaint out of malice. He signs it, gets it notarized, and submits it to the nursing board to clear my name immediately. If he does that, I don't sue him, and I don't take the forensics to the police." "That's extortion," Marcus chuckled. "Legally speaking, we call it a heavy-handed settlement negotiation." "Draft it," I said. We found out Mark was renting a cheap desk at a shared co-working space in the industrial district. His $7 million dream had evaporated, leaving him doing freelance coding for scrape-by wages. I didn't go to see him. I was done looking at his face. We sent a process server. The server walked into the open plan office at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, dropped a thick manila envelope on Mark's desk in front of a dozen other freelancers, and walked out. Inside the envelope was the forensic report, the draft of the lawsuit, a printout of the criminal statutes for false reporting, and the affidavit. There was a sticky note attached to the front. It was in my handwriting. It said, "You have 24 hours. Sign it, or I take whatever is left of you." He signed it. He didn't call to argue. He didn't try to negotiate. The next morning, Marcus received the notarized affidavit via courier. We forwarded it directly to the state nursing board and the hospital administration. The investigation was closed the same day. My suspension was lifted with full back pay. When I walked back onto the surgical floor the following Monday, the charge nurse looked up and smiled. "Glad had your back. We have a triple bypass in OR 3 inches 20 minutes. I'll go scrub in, I said. I walked into the scrub room, turned on the water, and grabbed the chlorhexidine sponge. I washed my hands, up to the elbows, watching the suds spiral down the stainless steel drain. The water was hot. The soap smelled sharp and clean. I didn't hear the name Mark for exactly 26 months. In that time, I became the head surgical nurse for the orthopedic wing. I replaced the windows in my coastal cottage with double-paned glass that kept the winter drafts out. I learned how to build a fire in the hearth without smoking out the living room. I lived a quiet, measured life. The kind of life that feels boring to someone who needs constant validation, but feels like a miracle to someone who survived a war. Then, on a Tuesday morning, my sister Sarah texted me a link. No context, just a URL to a popular business networking site and a single message, "Look at this clown." I was sitting in the break room with a lukewarm cup of coffee. I clicked the link. It was a long-form post written by Mark. He had a new profile picture. He was wearing a dark, unbranded t-shirt, staring thoughtfully off camera, sporting a graying beard. He looked like a man trying very hard to appear humbled by life. The headline read, "The Cost of Ambition: What Losing a $7 Million Dream Taught Me About Humanity." I read the first 3 paragraphs. It was a masterpiece of corporate spin. He wrote about the crushing pressure of startup culture and how the relentless pursuit of innovation blinded him to the people who mattered most. He never mentioned the hidden apartment. He didn't mention Elena. He certainly didn't mention trying to frame me for stealing fentanyl. Instead, he painted a picture of a man who simply cracked under the weight of his own genius, making regrettable personal missteps that cost him his marriage. He was branding himself as a redeemed founder. The comments were full of tech bros, praising his vulnerability and courage. At the very bottom of the post was the kicker. He announced he was launching a new venture capital firm focused on ethical tech startups, and he was currently seeking limited partners. I locked my phone, threw my empty coffee cup in the trash, and went back to work. I didn't care. Let him scam a new batch of investors. It wasn't my money, and it wasn't my problem. But Mark's PR campaign wasn't just digital. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, I was in my front yard pulling weeds around the hydrangeas. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and salt water. I heard the crunch of gravel and stood up, wiping my dirt-covered hands on my jeans. A silver rental car had pulled into my driveway. The driver's side door opened. Mark stepped out. He looked exactly like his new profile picture, the beard, the dark t-shirt, the performative humility. He stood by the car, keeping a safe distance, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I didn't move. I didn't invite him closer. I just stared at him. "Hi," he said. His voice was soft, practiced. "You have exactly 30 seconds to explain why you are standing on my property before I call the police," I said. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I felt nothing but a profound, heavy irritation. "I know I have no right to be here," he started, taking half a step forward. "I found your address through public tax records. I didn't come to start a fight. I came to make amends." 20 seconds, I said. He sighed, shaking his head like he was disappointed in my lack of grace. "I've been in therapy. I've spent the last 2 years looking at the man I became, and I hate him. I know what I did to you was unforgivable, but I'm trying to rebuild my life the right way this time. I needed to look you in the eye and apologize." I watched him. As a nurse, I'm trained to observe the physical tells of human distress. Real regret looks like slumped shoulders, erratic breathing, a reluctance to make eye contact. Mark was making direct, unblinking eye contact. His posture was perfectly controlled. His breathing was even. He wasn't making an apology. He was making a pitch. 10 seconds. He dropped the soft voice. His jaw tightened just a fraction. "I'm securing funding for my new firm. The lead investor is doing deep due diligence. They read the old blogs about the divorce. They know about the gallery. They want assurances that I'm not a liability." There it was, the tumor at the center of the scan. "They want me to clear you," I said. It wasn't a question. "They want to know the dust has settled," Mark corrected quickly. "They might reach out to you through a third party, a private investigator. All I'm asking, literally all I am asking, is that if they call, you just tell them it's in the past, that we've moved on. You don't have to praise me. Just don't burn me." I looked at the silver rental car. I looked at the man who had spent 4 years sleeping in 2 different beds, lying to 2 different women, trying to steal my financial future, and trying to destroy my medical license. He had driven 3 hours up the coast because a rich man in a suit told him his past was bad for business. "Mark," I said. The quiet finality in my voice made him flinch. "I am not your wife anymore. I am not your landlord. I am not your PR manager. And I am certainly not your alibi. It costs you nothing to just say we've moved on," he pleaded, a crack of real desperation finally showing through the facade. "You got what you wanted. You won. Why do you still need to punish me? I'm not punishing you. I'm just refusing to save you." I picked up my gardening shears from the grass. "If they call me, I will tell them the exact, documented truth. I will tell them about the lease, the loans you left Elena with, and the affidavit you signed to avoid a felony charge. What they do with that information is their business. You're going to kill this deal," he said, the anger rising to the surface, flushing his neck red. "No," I corrected him. "You killed it 4 years ago when you decided you were the smartest person in the room. Now get off my property." He stood there for a long moment. I could see the gears turning in his head, weighing the options, calculating if intimidation would work. But he looked at my face, and he saw what the jeweler saw, what the judge saw, what the hospital board saw. He saw a wall. He turned around, got into his rental car, and drove away. I watched the car disappear down the winding coastal road until it was just a speck, and then until it was nothing at all. The silence returned, thick and peaceful, broken only by the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks behind my house. I went back to pulling the weeds. I worked until the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. My back ached, my hands were raw, and I was deeply, profoundly content. The call came 8 days later. I was off rotation, sitting on my back deck with a mug of black coffee, watching a massive container ship cut a slow line across the gray horizon. My phone vibrated on the glass patio table. The caller ID showed a 212 area code, Manhattan. I answered it on the 3rd ring. "Am I speaking with Mark's former wife?" a man's voice asked. It was a dry, professional voice, the kind of voice that costs $800 an hour. "You are," I said. "My name is David Kessler. I am an independent risk analyst retained by a venture capital firm in New York. We are currently conducting executive executive due diligence on a prospective partner. I apologize for the intrusion, but your name came up during our background sweep regarding a civil matter. You want to know if Mark is a liability? I said. There was a brief pause. David Kessler was probably used to handling crying ex-wives, angry spouses, or people looking to settle a score. He wasn't used to someone diagnosing the problem before he finished reading his script. Yes, ma'am. That is the core of our inquiry. He disclosed the nature of your divorce, citing a personal failure under extreme stress. We are simply verifying that there are no outstanding legal or financial entanglements that could expose my client. I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm, bitter. Perfect. Do you have access to a secure email, Mr. Kessler? I do. Give me the address. He rattled off a string of letters and numbers. I put him on speakerphone, opened my laptop, and went to the encrypted folder I hadn't opened in 2 years. I attached a single PDF document. I just sent you a file, I said. It's a sworn notarized affidavit. In it, Mark confesses to fabricating a felony-level complaint to the state medical board in an attempt to have my nursing license revoked out of retaliation for our divorce settlement. It is a matter of legal record. I heard the click of a mouse on his end. Then, silence. The silence stretched for 30 seconds. I could hear the wind coming off the water, rattling the wind chimes my mother had bought me for my birthday. I waited. Ma'am, Kessler finally said. His voice had lost its rehearsed smoothness. It was rigid now. Can you verify the authenticity of this notary stamp? I can give you the name and phone number of the attorney who drafted it, and the process server who delivered it. You can verify it with them. That won't be necessary, he said quietly. A sworn admission of filing a false government report. This is substantial. Is there anything else you need to know about Mark's character under pressure, Mr. Kessler? No, he said. The line was totally dead of emotion now. You have been exceedingly helpful. Enjoy your afternoon. He hung up. I closed my laptop. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I didn't feel the need to call my sister or my lawyer to brag. I just felt a deep, enduring sense of order. The universe has a way of balancing its books, eventually. Sometimes you just have to be the accountant. I never heard from Mark again. 6 months later, Sarah texted me a screenshot of a LinkedIn profile. Mark had quietly deleted his post about the cost of ambition. His title had changed. He wasn't a founder anymore. He wasn't a venture capitalist. He was listed as a senior project manager at a mid-level logistics company in Ohio. He was exactly what he was terrified of being. Average. An employee. A guy in a cubicle answering to someone else, punching a clock, living a life stripped of the grand illusion he had sacrificed everything to build. I deleted the screenshot and didn't reply to Sarah. That was 4 years ago. I am 38 now. I am the charge nurse for the entire surgical floor. I train the new grads. I teach them how to stay calm when a patient crashes, how to compartmentalize the chaos, how to read the monitors instead of the panic in the room. My cottage is paid off. I adopted a retired greyhound named Barnaby who sleeps on the rug in front of the fireplace and only gets off the floor when he hears the cheese drawer open. I have a vegetable garden that I manage to keep alive, mostly. It's a strange thing to rebuild a life when the foundation of your old one was a mirage. You don't just distrust the bricks, you distrust the ground itself. For a long time after the phone call with David Kessler, I didn't let anyone in. I didn't date. I didn't flirt. If a man at a grocery store or a coffee shop tried to make conversation, I gave him a flat, one-word answer and put my headphones back on. I had built a fortress, and I was perfectly content to man the watchtower alone. Then came Ben. Ben is a flight paramedic. We met in the ER trauma bay after a multi-car pileup on the interstate. He came through the sliding doors covered in someone else's blood, smelling like diesel exhaust, rain, and sweat. He was giving the handoff report to the attending physician with a calm, methodical precision that caught my attention. In a room full of people shouting and machines blaring, Ben was the anchor. He didn't try to be the loudest or the smartest. He just did the work. 6 months later, he asked me out. I said no. A month after that, he asked again. I told him I was divorced, deeply cynical, and carried enough baggage to sink a ship. He just nodded, took a sip of his hospital cafeteria coffee, and said, I lift heavy things for a living. I'll pick you up at 7. Dating Ben was an exercise in unlearning my own hypervigilance. I hated how much I monitored him in the beginning. I hated that I noticed when he left his phone unlocked on my kitchen counter while he took a shower. I hated that a sick, twisted part of my brain whispered, check it, just a quick look, see what he's hiding. I never touched it, but the urge was a physical ache. It was the phantom limb of betrayal. One evening, we were sitting on my deck. Barnaby had his head resting on Ben's foot. Ben was scrolling through his phone, looking for a contractor to fix the roof on his cabin. His phone rang. A woman's name flashed on the screen. Sarah L. My stomach dropped into my shoes. It was a visceral, involuntary reaction. I felt the cold sweat instantly. Ben didn't hit ignore. He didn't turn the screen away. He answered it on speakerphone, right there on the table. Hey, Sarah, he said. Hey, Benny. A woman's voice came through the speaker, harried and loud. Listen, your idiot brother left his drill at my house again. Can you grab it tomorrow on your way to the station? It's blocking my driveway. Yeah, I'll grab it. Tell Mike I'm charging him a retrieval fee and beer. He hung up, jotted a note on a napkin, and went back to his search. He didn't look at me for validation. He didn't offer a preemptive explanation of who she was. He didn't have to. The absence of a lie is a very quiet thing, but when you're used to living in a war zone, that silence is deafening. I excused myself, went into the bathroom, locked the door, and cried. I didn't sob. I just let 4 years of defensive, hardened armor crack a little bit. It hurt. It hurt to realize how deeply Mark had conditioned me to expect a knife in the back. But life doesn't just move forward. It loops back when you least expect it. 3 weeks later, I checked my mailbox at the end of the driveway. Mixed in with the water bill and the grocery flyers was a small square envelope. The handwriting was shaky, cursive, and painfully familiar. It was from Helen, Mark's mother. I hadn't spoken to Helen since the night of the gallery. When I stood at the front of that room and projected her son's secret life onto the wall, she hadn't screamed or yelled. She had just put both of her hands over her mouth, tears spilling over her fingers, and stared at him like he was a monster she had accidentally let into the house. I took the envelope inside, sat at the kitchen island, and opened it. My dear, the letter began, I know you have every right to throw this away. I wouldn't blame you if you did. I am currently in hospice care at St. Jude's in the Valley. Pancreatic cancer. They tell me I have a few weeks left, at best. Mark's father passed away last year. I have no one to blame but myself for the silence between us, but I cannot leave this earth without looking you in the eye one last time. If you can find it in your heart, please come. Room 412. I stared at the paper. My first instinct was to tear it up. Helen and her husband had raised the man who tried to ruin me. They had shaped the arrogance, fed the ego, and shielded him from consequences until he thought he was untouchable. But I also remembered the Christmas we spent at their house when I was working night shifts. Helen had quietly packed me a week's worth of homemade dinners in Tupperware, so I wouldn't have to cook when I woke up at 4 p.m. She had loved me, in her own flawed way. I went the next morning. Street Jude's hospice smelled like bleach, stale coffee, and the quiet resignation of people waiting for the end. It's a smell I know intimately. I walked down the linoleum hallway to room 412. Helen was in the bed, propped up on thin pillows. She looked entirely diminished. The disease had stripped the flesh from her bones, leaving her looking hollow and fragile. The oxygen concentrator hummed loudly in the corner. She opened her eyes as I stood in the doorway. A weak, trembling smile broke across her face. "You came," she whispered. Her voice was like dry leaves. I pulled up the vinyl visitor's chair and sat down next to the bed. "I came, Helen." She reached out with a hand bruised purple from IV lines. I took it. Her skin was freezing. We sat in silence for a few minutes. As a nurse, I'm comfortable with the quiet of a sick room. You don't have to fill the air with meaningless platitudes. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her chest rattling with the effort. "I am so deeply sorry. You didn't cheat on me, Helen. You didn't hide the money." "No," she said, squeezing my hand with what little strength she had. "But I knew what he was. I always knew. When Mark was 12, he stole a watch from the neighbor's house. His father found it in his drawer. Mark didn't panic. He didn't cry. He looked us dead in the eye and invented an elaborate story about how a man at the park had given it to him for helping find a lost dog. It was such a good lie. So detailed. His father believed him. I didn't. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her sunken cheek. I never corrected his father. I never disciplined him. I watched him lie his way through high school, through college. He always believed his own version of reality. I told myself it was just ambition. I told myself he would outgrow it. When you married him, I thought, I hoped you would be the anchor that grounded him." She opened her eyes and looked at me, a desperate, seeking look. "I sacrificed you to him because it was easier than admitting I raised a son who had no conscience. Can you ever forgive me for that?" I looked at the woman in the bed. She was dying with the heavy, unbearable weight of a mother's ultimate failure. "He wasn't broken, Helen," I said gently, my voice steady. "And he wasn't your mistake to fix. He functioned exactly the way he wanted to. He made his choices. Every single day, he woke up and chose to be the man he is. You didn't force him to rent that apartment. You didn't force him to try to steal my license. But I built the foundation," she sobbed softly. "The foundation doesn't pull the trigger," I replied. "Mark is responsible for Mark. I don't carry any anger for you. I haven't for a very long time. You can let it go." She let out a long, shuddering breath as if a physical weight had been lifted from her chest. Her grip on my hand relaxed. We stayed like that for another hour, listening to the hum of the oxygen machine until she drifted into a narcotic sleep. I stood up, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, and walked out of the room. I didn't leave a note. I knew I would never see her again. When I walked out the sliding glass doors of the facility, the midday sun hit my face. It was a brisk, clear Tuesday. The air was sharp in my lungs. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from Ben. "Got off shift early, picked up steaks and that red wine you like. Barnaby says you need to come home now because he is starving to death. See you soon." I read the text twice. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. I unlocked my car, got in, and started the engine. I rolled the windows down, let the cold air whip through the cabin, and drove toward the coast, toward my house, toward the life I built from the ashes of someone else's lies. The surgery was a success. There was no scar tissue left. The patient was completely, finally, healed. Helen died 17 days later. I saw the short obituary in the Sunday paper. It didn't mention me, of course, and I didn't attend the service. I went for a walk on the beach with Barnaby and threw a tennis ball into the surf until my shoulder ached. That was my memorial for her. I thought the ledger was finally closed. I had my money, my house, my career, and my peace. But when you build a house on a foundation of financial fraud, the collapse doesn't just happen once. It echoes. 7 months later, on a Thursday morning, someone knocked on my door. I was on my second day off. I was wearing sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, drinking coffee and trying to finish a crossword puzzle. I opened the door expecting the Amazon delivery guy. Instead, a man and a woman in off-the-rack business suits were standing on my porch. They didn't look like salespeople. They had the weary, under-caffeinated look of government employees. The man held up a leather wallet with a gold badge. "Special Agent Miller, IRS Criminal Investigation Division. This is Agent Cho. Are you Mark's former spouse?" "Yes," I said. I didn't step back to let them in. "What is this about?" "It's regarding your ex-husband's former startup," Agent Cho said. Her voice was flat, practiced. "Specifically, the financial disclosures made during the attempted acquisition period 4 years ago. We'd like to ask you a few questions." I looked at the badges, and then at their faces. I felt a strange, cold detachment. The panic that used to seize me whenever Mark's name came up was gone. "I'll save you some time," I said. "I don't know anything about his corporate filings. I was a surgical nurse working 70 hours a week while he ran the company. I wasn't an officer, I wasn't a board member, and I didn't have access to his business accounts until we entered divorce proceedings." "We know that," Miller said. "We've reviewed your divorce settlement. In fact, that settlement is why we're here. During the discovery phase of your divorce, your attorney submitted a forensic accounting report detailing funds Mark attempted to divert into an offshore shell company to hide them from you." "Yes," I said. "He was trying to screw me out of my half of the sale. He was," Miller nodded slowly. "But in the process of moving those preliminary funds, he didn't just defraud you. He falsified capitalization tables and lied to his early-stage investors about the company's valuation to siphon the money. That crosses the line from a civil domestic dispute into federal wire fraud and tax evasion." I stared at him. Mark hadn't just been a cheating husband. He had been so arrogant, so convinced of his own untouchable genius, that he had tried to play a shell game with the federal government. "We need the raw data," Cho said. "We have the court summaries from your divorce, but we are subpoenaing the original hard drive you pulled his messages and financial drafts from. The old laptop." "I don't have it," I said. "I gave it to my lawyer, Marcus, 4 years ago. He kept it in a secure lockbox to ensure the chain of custody." "Then we'll be paying Marcus a visit this afternoon afternoon, Miller said, handing me a business card. If you remember anything else, any names of offshore contacts he might have mentioned in passing, any weird trips to the Caymans or Switzerland, call us. He never took me anywhere, I said, looking at the card. He said we couldn't afford vacations until the company sold. Miller gave me a look that was almost sympathetic. Right, well, thank you for your time. I closed the door and locked it. I walked back to the kitchen island, picked up my coffee, and took a sip. It was cold. I dumped it down the sink and called Marcus. The IRS just left my porch, I told him when he answered. Marcus let out a long, low whistle. Well, the chickens have officially come home to roost. I'll have the lockbox ready for them. You're clear, by the way. Your name is nowhere near his corporate entities. You're just the whistleblower who didn't know she was blowing a federal whistle. What happens to him? I asked. If they have the paper trail for wire fraud, he goes to federal prison, Marcus said, his tone entirely matter-of-fact. The feds don't knock on doors unless they already have 90% of the puzzle solved. They just needed the laptop for the final nail. I hung up and went back to my crossword puzzle. I couldn't focus on the clues. For 4 years, I had watched Mark scramble to maintain the illusion of his superiority. He had sacrificed his marriage, bankrupted his mistress, alienated his family, and weaponized my medical license, all to avoid admitting he wasn't the smartest guy in the room. And now, an auditor with a calculator and a government pension was going to put him in a cage. It was the most boring, bureaucratic, unglamorous end possible. It was perfect. 6 months later, the indictment came down. It didn't make the front page of the big tech blogs. By then, Mark was old news. A failed founder who never actually launched his golden parachute. It was a short, 3-paragraph blurb in the local business journal. Former tech CEO indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and tax evasion. He pleaded guilty. He didn't have the money for a drawn-out trial, and the evidence extracted directly from his own synced messages on the laptop he forgot about was ironclad. He was sentenced to 36 months in a minimum security federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania, plus mandatory restitution to the investors he defrauded. I was at work when I read the news on my phone in the break room. Janine, the nurse I had confided in on the day I filed for divorce, was sitting across the table eating a yogurt. She noticed me staring at the screen. What is it? She asked. Bad news? No, I said, locking the screen and sliding the phone into my scrub pocket. Just reading the weather report. Looks like the storm finally passed. She smiled. Good. I'm tired of the rain. I stood up, threw my empty water bottle in the recycling bin, and headed back out to the floor. The surgical board was full. We had a spinal fusion in OR1, an appendectomy in OR2, and a total knee replacement in OR4. Real problems. Tangible things that could be fixed with scalpels, sutures, and steady hands. That evening, I drove home with the windows down. The coastal air was sharp and smelled like pine and salt water. When I pulled into the driveway, Ben's truck was already there. I walked through the front door. The house was warm. Barnaby trotted over, his tail doing a lazy, rhythmic thump against the doorframe. I scratched him behind the ears and walked into the kitchen. Ben was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of marinara sauce. He was wearing jeans and a faded gray t-shirt, barefoot on the hardwood floor. He looked over his shoulder and smiled. Hey, he said. Rough shift? Long, I said, dropping my bag on the chair. But good. We saved a guy's leg. Nice work. He tapped the wooden spoon on the edge of the pot. Dinner's ready in 10. Pour us some wine? Yeah, I can do that. I grabbed 2 glasses from the cabinet and opened a bottle of cheap, heavy red wine. I walked out onto the back deck and leaned against the railing. The sun was setting, bleeding dark purple and burnt orange into the water. The tide was coming in, the waves crashing against the rocks in a steady, ancient rhythm. I thought about the gallery. I thought about the tailored suit Mark wore, the fake smile, the glass of champagne in his hand when he called me his secret weapon. I thought about the sheer, suffocating terror of realizing my entire life was a stage play I hadn't read the script for. And then I thought about the 3-carat ring sitting in a safe at a women's shelter, the federal prison in Pennsylvania, and the quiet hum of the oxygen machine in Helen's room. I didn't feel victorious. Victory implies a game, and a marriage isn't a game. I just felt clean. The infection had been severe, but the amputation had saved my life. Ben pushed the screen door open and stepped out onto the deck, handing me a plate of pasta. He clinked his wine glass against mine. To a quiet night, he said. To a quiet night, I echoed. I took a bite of the food. It was hot, rich, and real. I looked at the man standing next to me, at the dog sleeping by the sliding glass door, and at the solid, unshakable walls of the house I owned. I had lost 4 years of my life to a lie, but the truth had given me the rest of it. We lived in that quiet rhythm for 3 years. Federal prison isn't like the movies, especially for white-collar criminals. There are no dramatic riots or shivs in the yard. It's mostly just crushing, bureaucratic boredom. It's beige walls, scheduled phone calls, and the slow, grinding realization that your time is no longer your own. For a man like Mark, who measured his worth by how much he controlled the people around him, I imagined boredom was its own kind of torture. I didn't keep track of his sentence. I didn't have a calendar with big red X's marking the days until his release. I was too busy living. At the hospital, I was promoted again, this time to clinical director of the surgical department. It meant less time holding retractors in the OR and more time dealing with budgets, staffing, and hospital administrators. It was exhausting, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. It was the weight of responsibility, not the weight of deception. One Tuesday afternoon in early November, I found one of my new scrub nurses, a 23-year-old named Chloe, crying in the sterile supply closet. She was sitting on a step stool surrounded by boxes of saline, her face buried in her hands. I closed the door behind me and leaned against the wire shelving. Are you hurt or are you mad? I asked. Chloe sniffled and wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Doctor. Evans yelled at me in front of the whole team. He asked for a 10-blade, I handed him a 10-blade, and he threw it back on the Mayo stand and said he asked for a 15. He told me I was incompetent, but I know what he said. I know I heard him right. You did, I said. I was standing by the door. He asked for a 10. Chloe looked up, her eyes red. Then why did he do that? Why make me look stupid? Because the patient's blood pressure was dropping. He was losing his margins, and he felt out of control. I told her, my voice perfectly level. When arrogant people lose control of a situation, they look for someone else to carry the blame. It's a reflex. It has nothing to do with you. I should have defended myself, she whispered. No, I said. Defending yourself implies there's a debate. There isn't. Next time he does it, you don't apologize. eyes. You don't argue. You just hand him the 15 blade, look him dead in the eye, and say, here is the 15 you need. You state the fact, and you move on. You do not absorb their panic. She took a shaky breath and nodded. Just state the fact. Exactly. Now wash your face and get back to OR 3. The patient needs you. Dr. Evans' ego can wait. I watched her walk to the scrub sink. It's a hard lesson to learn, that other people's dysfunctions are not your cross to bear. It took me 34 years and a forensic accountant to learn it. I was hoping to save Chloe some time. When I got home that evening, Ben was out back, chopping firewood. The rhythmic times, thwack times of the axe echoed across the yard. I checked the mailbox at the end of the driveway. Inside were the usual catalogs, a bill from the water company, and a thick brown envelope with the seal of the United States Department of Justice, stamped in the top left corner. I didn't freeze. My heart didn't skip a beat. I just walked up the driveway, dropped my bag on the porch chair, and opened it. It was a notification from the Bureau of Prisons. Mark had served 30 months of his 36-month sentence. He was petitioning for early release to a federal halfway house located in our county. Included in the packet was a copy of his statement of rehabilitation, a document he had written to the parole board to prove he was ready to re-enter society. I leaned against the porch railing and read it. It was 4 pages of the most exquisite, manipulative garbage I had ever seen. He wrote about his spiritual awakening in the facility. He claimed he had taken responsibility for his financial missteps, but the 3rd paragraph is what made me stop. I have spent the last 30 months making internal amends with the people my actions hurt the most, Mark wrote. I have reached a place of mutual forgiveness with my former spouse, and I look forward to returning to the county to rebuild a productive, honest life as a contributing member of the community. Mutual forgiveness. He was using my silence as an endorsement. He assumed that because I hadn't sued him into the ground, because I hadn't destroyed him publicly beyond the gallery, I had forgiven him. He was trying to leverage the peace I built for myself to get out of a federal facility 6 months early. There was a second form attached to the back of the packet, A times Victim Impact Addendum. It was optional. I could fill it out to support his release, contest it, or simply throw it in the trash and let the system decide. Ben walked up the steps onto the deck, wiping sweat from his forehead with the hem of his t-shirt. He saw the DOJ envelope in my hand. Federal mail, he noted, grabbing a bottle of water from the outdoor cooler. IRS again? Bureau of Prisons, I said. I handed him Mark's statement. Ben leaned against the rail next to me and read the paragraph I pointed to. He didn't get angry. He didn't flex his jaw. He just let out a short, incredulous laugh. Mutual forgiveness, Ben read aloud. He handed the paper back to me. The guy really has a gift for fiction. What do you want to do with it? I don't know, I said honestly. Part of me wants to ignore it. He's going to get out eventually anyway. 6 months doesn't change the fact that he's a convicted felon. But the idea of him sitting in a room, telling a board of officials that I forgave him, that I'm somehow part of his redemption arc, it makes my skin crawl. Then don't let him tell the story, Ben said simply. He took a drink of water. You're the clinical director. If a surgeon writes a fake chart note, what do? I correct the chart. So correct the chart. Ben kissed the top of my head, smelled like cedar and sweat, and walked inside to start dinner. I sat down at the patio table. I took a black pen from my purse. I didn't write a long, emotional letter. The federal government doesn't care about your feelings. They care about risk assessment. I filled out the blank lines on the Victim Impact Addendum with surgical precision. To the review board, I wrote, I am the former spouse of the inmate. I am writing to explicitly correct a fraudulent claim made in his petition for early release. The inmate states we have reached a place of mutual forgiveness. This is a fabrication. There has been no contact between us in over 3 years. I have not forgiven him, nor do I intend to. The inmate's crimes were not mistakes born of pressure. They were calculated actions. Prior to his federal indictment, he fabricated a felony-level complaint to the state medical board in an attempt to destroy my nursing license out of sheer malice. I have attached a copy of his sworn affidavit admitting to this act. He is not a rehabilitated man seeking to rejoin society. He is a narcissist attempting to manipulate this board the exact same way he manipulated his investors and his family. I strongly oppose his early release to a halfway house in this county. He remains a liability to anyone who mistakenly trusts him. I signed it, dated it, and put it in the return envelope. I attached the PDF of his old affidavit that I kept backed up on a flash drive. I drove to the post office the next morning before my shift and dropped it in the blue box. 3 weeks later, I received a standard automated letter from the BOP. Petition for early release. Denied. Inmate will serve the remainder of the statutory sentence. He wasn't getting the halfway house. He wasn't getting the early exit. He was going to sit in his cell, eat the cafeteria food, and stare at the beige walls for every single one of the remaining 180 days. I put the denial letter in the shredder in my home office. That night, it snowed. It was the first heavy snowfall of the year. Thick, wet flakes that stuck to the pine trees and covered the gravel driveway in a blanket of absolute white. The ocean looked like a dark, bruised bruise against the snow. Ben had built a fire in the hearth. Barnaby was stretched out on the rug, twitching in his sleep, probably dreaming about chasing rabbits he was far too slow to catch. I was sitting on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading, watching the flames. Ben walked in from the kitchen with 2 mugs of hot tea. He handed me one and sat down next to me, resting his arm across the back of the sofa. We sat there for a long time, just listening to the crackle of the wood and the wind howling against the double-paned glass. My lease is up at the cabin in February, Ben said quietly, not looking at me, just looking at the fire. I know, I said. I was thinking I probably shouldn't renew it. I turned my head to look at him. He was still watching the fire. There was no anxiety in his posture, no desperate need for an answer. He was just stating a fact. Barnaby takes up a lot of space on the bed, I warned him. I'll sleep on the edge, Ben replied. He set his mug down on the coffee table. He turned to me, his dark eyes steady. He didn't pull out a ring. He didn't get down on one knee. He knew me too well for that. He knew I had already had the grand, performative gestures. I had the tailored suits and the 3-carat diamonds and the speeches in front of crowds. I knew exactly what those things were worth. I don't want a wedding, he said. I don't want to sign a government contract to prove I'm not going anywhere. I just want to live here, with you. I want to want to chop the wood, and I want to hear about your day at the hospital, and I want to be the guy who makes sure your car starts when it's freezing outside. He reached over and took my hand. His hands were rough, calloused from years of lifting stretchers and climbing out of helicopters. They were the hands of a man who worked for a living. I'm not a tech genius, he said softly. I'm never going to have $7 million, but I will never lie to you, and I will never leave you. I looked at our hands intertwined. I didn't feel the old panic. I didn't feel the need to check his phone or hire an accountant. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of safety. It wasn't the kind of safety that comes from ignorance. It was the safety that comes from knowing exactly how bad the world can be, and knowing that the person sitting next to you will hold the line anyway. Move your stuff in this weekend, I said. He smiled, a real quiet smile. Okay. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. The house was cold, but the bed was warm. Ben was asleep next to me, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Barnaby was snoring at the foot of the bed. I slipped out from under the covers and walked into the kitchen to start the coffee. The sun was just starting to come up over the water, turning the snow blindingly bright. I thought about Mark one last time. He was waking up on a thin mattress, surrounded by concrete, waiting for a guard to tell him when he could eat, when he could walk, when he could speak. He had spent his entire life trying to hoard money, status, and control. He had tried to buy a life. I stood in my kitchen, smelling the coffee brewing, listening to the quiet breathing of the man and the dog who chose to be here with me. You can't buy a life, you have to build it, brick by brick, truth by truth. I poured a cup of coffee, walked out onto the back deck in my bare feet, and let the freezing morning air hit my face. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, clean air. I was 38 years old. I had nothing to hide and no one to fear. I went back inside and closed the door.